Okay, we're continuing with this book here, The Best of the West in Art, Movie, Music, and Books by me, Pete Rogers. We're on the chapter 7 now, page 199, where we talk about the role of the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans in the development of Western civilization. As Edith Hamilton had said, the ancient Greeks were the first Westerners. They are the beginning of Western civilization. They are the beginning of free speech and debate. The ancient Greeks are awesome. Ayn Rand had said it, and everybody who studied history knows this. The three greatest golden ages of the mind in human history are the ancient Greeks, the Italian Renaissance, and then the 1800s in Europe. Those are the big three golden ages when great intelligence and creative intellectual achievement was celebrated. Okay, so here's a quote by Will Durant, the great historian. He says, "Ancient Greece is the bright morning of Western civilization. Excepting machinery, there is hardly anything secular in our culture that does not come from the ancient Greeks. Schools, gymnasiums, arithmetic, geometry, history, rhetoric, physics, biology, anatomy, poetry, music, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, stoicism, cynicism, skepticism, Epicureanism, politics, theology, philanthropy, plutocracy, tyranny, democracy, these are all Greek words. If we wish to understand the Greeks as against the Romans, we must think of the French versus the English. If we wish to feel the Spartan spirit as opposed to the Athenians, we must think of the Germans versus the French." Okay, and you can also see there that Will Durant loves the French. Will Durant thinks that Voltaire is the greatest writer who ever lived. So he is giving France more status than it deserves to say that France was like Athens. Okay, don't get me wrong, there's some great stuff that happened in France. That's where the cathedrals came from, the University of Paris with St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay. Here's a quote by Will Durant. "The Catholic Church did not abolish paganism. It adopted it." Yeah, and I've alluded to that earlier, that the Catholic Church coexisted with paganism for 500 years. Paganism was still going strong up until the mid-500s. And because of that, Catholic Church is cool. It can handle other cultures, other people, and get along with them very well. It's a very mellow form of Christianity. It's not, it doesn't have a bug up its butt like Calvinism does, for example. Or the Puritans. It's not like that. Catholicism is actually fun. I went to a Catholic school for a while. It was fun. Okay. All right. Now here is Pandora's Box, painted by John William Waterhouse in 1896. And it's very much like the story of Adam and Eve. And the closer one looks, the more similarities one will see to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Christians. The ancient Greeks, like many other ancient cultures, had a flood story. This is Deucalion holding his wife aloft, painting by Paul Muart. Deucalion's son's name was Helen, and that's why the Greeks are the Hellenes. Greek culture, Greek religion is called Hellenic paganism. All right, and that was the classical Greek age from about 510 BC, the time of the last tyrant to fall in Athens, versus up until 323. BC. 323 BC was the death of Alexander the Great. Aristotle died 1 year later in 324 BC, but that then becomes the Hellenistic age. Okay, the Hellenistic age meant that Alexander the Great had conquered sort of all the Mediterranean world, and thus the leadership was his former generals, who now imposed the Greek language and Greek culture upon those peoples, which is also thought to have spread the way for Christianity and the New Testament being in Greek. Okay, and then the Roman Empire spread the way for the rapid spread of Christianity through the world. Okay, and getting back to the idea of the flood, it being pretty ubiquitous in ancient cultures. Like Mesopotamia means between two rivers. Okay, which do flood. A quote from Ann Coulter in her book Godless. She said, "God believers do not need evolution to be false, but atheists need evolution to be true. And that's why there is mass panic whenever someone mentions the vast and accumulating evidence against evolution. Far from showing gradual change with one species slowly giving way to another, as Darwin hypothesized, the fossil record showed vast numbers of new species suddenly appearing out of nowhere, remaining largely unchanged for millions of years and then disappearing almost like there was a big flood or something. So Ann Coulter's very clever and funny. Yeah, and Darwinism, by the way, is bogus, just so you know. It's good for explaining why you got a variety of cats and dogs. It's not good for explaining macroevolution at all. That's not just my opinion. I'm an expert in evolution, by the way. I majored in it, A+ student in college, okay? And I've read a lot about it since. Look up Dennis Noble. Look at all these other great experts. James Tour, Michael Behe, Douglas Axe. There's a whole bunch of them. Okay, Prometheus bound, being saved by Hercules, who shot the eagle with an arrow. The eagle symbolizing Zeus punishing Prometheus. Prometheus was sort of a prototype of a Christ-like figure who sacrificed himself to help mankind. The later Christ-like figure amongst the ancient Greeks was Socrates, the saint of philosophy who sacrificed himself, to preserve free speech and philosophy. So here is the painting The Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David in 1787. And you can see Platelet sitting at the edge of the bed all sad because the best man in Athens was being killed. Socrates had argued himself to death, pissed off the Athenian jury. And they were largely he could be annoying at times, like was portrayed by Aristophanes in his play of the Clouds, but also he was a great man, okay? And that's kind of how you work towards knowledge, is with a Socratic questioning. You question down until you get to the truth. And that's sort of the first step in knowledge, being a little bit skeptical and questioning to work towards the truth, having a debate with others to sound it out and figure out what you can hold up in a conversation with others who both are willing to learn with an open mind. Then Aristotle sort of solidified the concept of logic, especially deductive logic, with the syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore he is mortal. So syllogistic logic, deductive logic means you have all the information. You simply have to put it in order to come to a true conclusion. And that's sort of the opposite form of logic compared to inductive logic. Inductive logic is when you have to look at a bunch of clues, like consilience, and then see if they all support a given conclusion. And you add them all up together in aggregate, they become a strong support for that conclusion. That's inductive logic. So deductive logic is sort of a left brain dominant predator mentality. Inductive logic is receptive, thinking, analyzing, looking out, paranoid, if you will. And that is a prey mentality, sort of more of a right brain, holistic thinking, inductive logic. Okay. Okay, let's see here. Oh, here's a quote by Alfred North Whitehead. He said, "All of philosophy is a footnote to Plato." That's a quote by Alfred North Whitehead. Socrates, the purpose of philosophy is to determine how we ought to live, like Christian ethics is what was later figured out. In order to decide to live well, we should try to learn what is good for us, like the low-fat vegan diet, and what is bad for us, processed foods and oils. T. Colin Campbell wrote one of his books. He wrote, of course, China Studies, his big book, but he wrote a couple other books. And one of the things he talked about was Socrates had actually talked about some of the problems of eating a high-meat diet causing the health problems that we talk about today. So there was some understanding of that back in his day. And of course, Pythagoras was the developmenter of the vegetarian diet because he thought people were reincarnated into animals, and therefore he didn't want people to eat the animals because you could be eating a reincarnated person that you knew. So the vegetarian diet for over 1,000 years was called the Pythagorean diet. And Plato was very much influenced by the works of Pythagoras, who also emphasized math. That's the Pythagorean theorem, okay, and reincarnation, and he was a bit of a mystic, okay. So Plato really comes down strong down that path. And Socrates is kind of connected to Plato, okay, whereas Aristotle was more like in the School of Athens painting behind me. Aristotle was more down to earth. He was a biologist. His father was a doctor. Okay, and that's sort of the Platonic way of seeing things and the Aristotelian way of seeing things have strongly shaped almost all of history since that time. And basically, the Aristotelian method is better. Aristotelianism is the form that went through Catholicism, through St. Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, before him his mentor, from 1200 to 1280 AD, and then Thomas Aquinas with the Summa Theologica and the idea of uniting man with reason and bringing us down to earth, saying, let us study nature, not simply ponder the heavens, okay? And that got man to start doing a lot of good science because he became interested in nature, what was right in front of his eyes, like from the Aristotelian point of view. In a sense, Thomas Aquinas had baptized Aristotle and that mentality, whereas the Platonic streak of Christianity largely went through Augustine, and that came up with a lot of things I don't agree with, predestination, for example. And that same streak led to Martin Luther, led to the Protestant Reformation, led to Calvinism, predestination, and the weakness of Protestantism is it doesn't connect directly to Christ, and then it leads to secularism because they let the secular ruler take over. But don't get me wrong, Protestants have done a lot of good stuff, especially in the 1800s, like the Victorian Renaissance. They had some magnificent painters from the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood disciples, and to they had the great writers like Charles Dickens, one of the greatest writers of all time. So anyways, we're going to leave it at that for this time. Next time we'll come back and I'll go through all the things that the Greeks were first at, and you'll be amazed at how much of modern world is shaped by those ancient Greeks. Okay, hope you found that helpful.